What I think is so interesting about it, what's really captivating about it, comes down to the fact that your reality and the world you perceive around you is not an absolute reality, although you think it is, and I know I think mine is, but it's not. Your reality, that is the world as you perceive it, is nothing more than that which your sensory receptors are able to detect in the world, the sights and the sounds and the smells. But that's only half of it. The other half of it is what your brain then takes and operates on that sensory information to perform computations that then result in your percepts. So the idea then is that your reality is really limited by your abilities to sense only certain things in the environment and by the particular constructs that your brain is able to make out of those things. In other words, what you perceive in the world and your reality is nothing more than that which your brain makes of it. And now comes the really spooky part. Because if you had a different set of receptors, and if your brain operated in a different way, the world would appear to you in an entirely different way, one that you can't even begin to imagine. To take this idea a little further, I want you to consider the idea of color. All right? I always think of color as a natural attribute of something. You know, one of my friends has a hot red Mercedes. That car is identified in my mind by its color. Someone has red hair, or brown hair, or red eyes, the daffodil is yellow, whatever. We attribute a feature to that object, and yet there is no such thing as color. Color is a construct that your brain makes of the wavelengths that are in the environment. Not necessarily the wavelength from that particular object, but the wavelengths from the totality of your environment. And if you had different receptors, and if your brain operated on them in a different way, you would see something entirely different that would be unrecognizable to you. And let me make this point. There's a wonderful essay by a neurologist named Oliver Sacks. He's one of my heroes. And he talks about a man who suffered a stroke, both sides of his brain, to a small, tiny little part of his brain that caused him to lose his ability to see color. He was an artist. He couldn't see color, he couldn't dream in color, he couldn't imagine color. And he went through a tremendously depressing episode. And after 2 years of coping with this, he had an epiphany. One day he just came home and he saw the light, the sun, rising. And he saw it in stark contrasts. And he started to paint again, and they asked him, if we could restore your color vision, would you want to have it done? Remarkably, what he said was, no, I don't want it. I don't want it back at all. I would have done anything 2 years ago to get it back, but now I don't want it. And the reason I don't want it is because I see the world differently now. I see it in terms of stark contrasts of blacks and whites and grays. Something that you can't see and that I can't see because we're blinded by color. The point is, he sees his world in an entirely different way than we see our world because a part of his brain isn't operating. I find that absolutely remarkable. But if you think about it a little bit more, imagine what the world would be like if you had receptors, that is, parts of your sensory system that were able to detect energies in the world that you normally can't detect, and that your brain was able to make computations on those things to allow you to perceive them. What would the world look like to you? Well, the world is full of animals that we share this planet with. And those animals have to adopt to their own world. And they have very exotic senses. In fact, the whole world is full of animals that have exotic senses. And some of these I'd like to point out to you. And I think one is on the first slide, if I can advance it. Yes. In fact, I'd like to point out three. One is our old friend the rattlesnake that you find here in Texas. Let me see if I can use the pointer here. I can. See, it's got two things here. It's got two eyes. It's got a regular eye that it sees light that's reflected from objects just like you and I see. And then down here you can see a pit. That pit is an eye. But it's not an eye like you and I see. It's an eye that sees infrared, something that we're not privy to. In other words, what this animal sees is body heat. Right? These animals, these little insects, the bees, right? They see ultraviolets. We can't see ultraviolets. The ways they see a flower is entirely differently than the way we see a flower. And this guy over here, this is an electric fish, a weakly electric fish. This is the kind of fish my colleague, neurobiology, Harold Zakin, works on. And the way these fish see their environment is absolutely bizarre. What they do is they take a piece of muscle back here, in their tail, right back here, and instead of having it contract the way normal muscle does, they got rid of all that contraction and they turned it into a little device that puts out an electric current, an electric field around themselves. And they have special sensors that sense that electric field. And the way they see their world, living in the muddy waters of Africa and South America, are by distortions in the electric field that surrounds them. I can't even begin to imagine what the world must look like to an electric fish, because they have their brains and I have mine, and theirs are entirely different. But I can begin to imagine what a rattlesnake must see. This is how a dog would look to us in daylight. This is how it would look to us at nighttime. And this is what it would look like to a rattlesnake who sees the heat from that dog. And what you can see here, somebody was sitting here. They left the heat. And this is how a little butterfly, yellow butterfly, appears to you. But this is how a bee sees a butterfly. And I can't even begin to imagine what these electric fish and how they must perceive their worlds by the distortions in the electric fields that they produce around themselves. Right? So this world of sensory exotica brings me to bats. Right? Because, of course, Austin is in love with bats. Every night people go down to the Congress Street Bridge and they watch the bats fly out in this great exodus as they go into the night sky, into their hunting grounds. Long before Austinites became enamored with bats, there were people who thought a great deal about it and who really wondered about it. And what they wondered about was, how are these animals able to maneuver with such dexterity and with such enormous speed in the pure dark where vision is of no use? And the history of this inquiry goes way back. It goes way back to the 18th century, to this man. His name was Lazzaro Spallanzani. And Spallanzani was a major figure in the 1800s. He was a scientist in Italy who was interested in a number of things, but his main claim to fame was inquiring about what at that time was perhaps one of the great scientific questions of the day. Did life emerge from life, or did it emerge spontaneously? And Spallanzani was one of the great figures who showed for sure that life emerged only from other life and did not emerge spontaneously. But he was interested in many things, and one of the things he found interesting was that as he walked through the passageways in his home, what he could find were bats that were just flying around, zooming around in the pitch dark. And he asked, how are they able to do this? And being a scientist of the first rank, and he was, he undertook what scientists do. That is, what he did was he eliminated one sense at a time. He coated the bats with varnish in order to get rid of their sense of touch. And when he did that, he found that they could still fly and find their way around the dark. He then blinded them, took away their sense of vision. He found that it had no influence on them at all. They still found their way around the dark as ably as they could when they were normal. The only thing that interfered with their ability to fly and to maneuver in the dark was when he plugged their ears. They were completely helpless. And he published this. And there was another scientist in France, his name was Louis Chérine, who simultaneously did similar studies. They came to the same conclusion, that it must be the sense of hearing that bats are using in order to orient in their environment in the dark without use of vision. Nobody could believe this. They couldn't believe it because they said it must be something having to do with touch. But of course, Spallanzani eliminated that. He coated them with varnish. It couldn't have been touch. They said, how could it possibly be sound? There is no sound. That is, there is no sound that they could hear. And for them, and for us, our reality is only based on our sensory receptors, which inform us about the world. And since they couldn't hear any sound, there was no sound. And if there is no sound to hear, how could the bats be using sound? So ridicule became the order of the day. And what they said to him was, if bats can see with their ears, can they hear with their eyes? Well, of course not, right? And there the issue lay. It lay for 140 years. until two graduate students at Harvard in the late 1930s took up the issue. Their names were Donald Griffin and Robert Galambos. This is a picture of Donald Griffin. He just passed away this year. Dr. Griffin, time of being a graduate student, was extremely interested in bats. In fact, he was interested in bats as a boy. He used to go into the caves. He used to band them, find out if they came back to the same cave, how long they lived, all these things. He was an inquiring biologist. What he did as a graduate student, he hooked up with another graduate student, Robert Galambos, who was a neurophysiologist, an auditory neurophysiologist, someone who studies how the auditory system works. And together they took up the question that Spallanzani had taken up, but although they knew nothing of Spallanzani at that time. They repeated his experiments with the same results, except in this case, something happened. And what happened was that there was a scientist, an engineer at Harvard at that time. His name was George Washington Pierce. And Pierce was experimenting with new devices for sonar and radar that were becoming important because it was on the eve of the Second World War. So Griffin convinced Pierce to allow him to bring one of his bats into the lab and to turn on these ultrasonic devices that would allow him perhaps to hear some kinds of sounds. And when he did it, he said the result was absolutely stunning. The whole room just came alive with these clicks that they could now hear that the bats were making. So the issue then was solved. What they found was, of course, there's sound. It's just ultrasound, sound beyond our hearing range, which Pierce's devices could record and pick up. Together with Galambos, these two guys then proved that bats not only use echolocation, a term that Griffin then coined to describe this form of biological sonar. Galambos then showed that their ears could actually respond to these sounds, and this was a major discovery. In fact, these two guys became extremely important scientists. Griffin went on to form one of the great schools of behavioral neuroscience at Harvard and later on at Rockefeller University, and Galambos became one of the great fathers of sensory auditory neurophysiology. Today his work is still classic. Both of these men, incidentally, were very early in their careers elected to the National Academy of Sciences. So, what Griffin then showed was not only that bats could orient, that is, fly and detect objects by using sound, that is, by using biological sonar, by emitting a loud signal and listening to the echoes that came back. He showed why this was. He showed that bats could actually hunt insects by using this form of biological sonar, by echolocation. Right? And now the whole question came into focus. That is, the whole rationale and the pressures, the selective pressures that drove this ability to echolocate became apparent. And what became apparent was that in nature there's always an intense competition for food. And that sitting out there in the night sky is an untapped source of food. It's literal smorgasbord. And all you have to do to tap into that source of food, for which there's almost no competition, is do two things. One, develop an ability to fly, and two, develop an ability to see in the dark. So what bats did is they indeed developed an ability to fly. Right? And, whoop, I didn't want to do that. Come back to that in a moment. The way they fly is by taking their fingers, these are their fingers, and turning their fingers into hands. Right? And then stretching a membrane across it, and that became their wings. And as a consequence of that, bats are classified in their own taxonomic grouping. In fact, they're unique. What separates bats from all other animals is that they have this ability to fly. They're the only mammals capable of powered flight. And they belong to the order Chiroptera, which means wing-handed. Right? What they then did is they took a pre-existing ability. That is, we all have to hear echoes. I'm hearing echoes right now. Your auditory system of every animal has to deal with echoes. In some manner, what these bats did was take this ability to new heights and enable them to perform an active process. What I mean by active is actually emitting a pulse and then listening to those echoes and being able to interpret it. What Griffin found was that not only can they detect objects and hunt objects, but by hunting objects it implied, in fact it required, that what they're doing is they're forming three-dimensional images of these objects on the basis of sound. They know where they are in space, in verticality, in azimuth, at distance, and what's more, they can recognize it. They know what's a tasty insect from an insect that's not so palatable. They can, in essence, if you will, see with their ears. They really can. And this is a movie that Griffin made many, many years ago, but it's still very charming. All right? And I want you to watch it. And what he shows here is, this just is one segment of it. You're going to see a bat, and it's in slow motion, it's been slowed down, and you're going to hear him emitting his echolocation calls. He's going to go chip, 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 and they flip up an insect, in this case a little mealworm, and this bat is going to track this insect. You can hear him emitting his calls, you can watch him, and then what he's going to do is he's going to take his wing, he's going to scoop that insect out of the air. All right? It's quite dramatic. So let's take a look at it. Here he goes. There's the insect. Can you hear that? Can you hear that? Or you want me to put the microphone next to it? You can hear it, okay? All right. Classical Griffin, classical echolocation. All right. You want me to play it again? Okay, pretty cool. If I can figure out how to get this back, there we go. Okay, here we go. Nope, didn't want to do that. Wait a minute. How do I get rid of this? Yeah, there we go. Okay. There's the insect. There. Did I do that? How did that happen? I didn't touch anything. Okay. All right. So you see this adaptation here. The adaptation is the ability now to use sound as a substitute for vision in seeing your world. It's incredibly successful. It's one of the most successful adaptations nature has ever created. It allowed bats basically to populate every segment of the Earth except for the polarized caps. They ravage the insects. I mean, the insects don't stand a chance. These guys fly at 30, 40 miles an hour. They can detect these insects and catch them before they know what happens. They're enormously successful. And in fact, they're considered to be the most successful of any mammal. There are more than 1,000 species of bats. Not only in terms of species, but in terms of actual numbers. To give you an idea, there are 20 million Mexican free-tailed bats, a single species, in one cave in Bracken Cave in Texas. I don't know how many are in the Congress Street Bridge, but if there aren't a million there, there aren't any. They're all over the city. They're virtually most caves in Texas. There are enormous numbers of animals. And they're in such numbers because of the success that they have in hunting insects by using echolocation. And as they populated the Earth, how do I get this to move? Oh, we're going to see him do it again. That's okay. Everybody likes this. Pardon me? I did press the right arrow. Oh, the right arrow. Thank you very much. There he goes. Okay. Okay. Bracken Cave, Texas. A lot of bats coming out there. They went all over the world. And they didn't just eat insects. Because, you know, if there's something to eat, you're going to eat it. So they started to specialize on various other food items as well. And in order to do this, something very interesting had to happen. And that is you had to adapt. You had to adapt your body to do this, and you had to adapt your brain, that is, your sonar system, in order to do this. So some of these bats then started to eat all kinds of things. And I'd like to show you some pictures of some of these bats and the things that they eat. This is a picture of a horseshoe bat. Not as dramatic as the movie, but here he's coming in, he sees the insect, sees him by his sonar, here he's about to close in on him, and here he's going to catch him with his wing, and here he's bringing him up, and he's going to have his dinner. Right? This guy's coming home with a big katydid. Right? This is one of the more elegant bats. This is a fishing bat. His name is Noctilio. They live in South America and in Latin America. What they do is they fly over the lakes and just estuaries. And they're emitting these echolocation calls. You can see he's got his mouth open, right? And what they're going to detect is any ripple on the surface. The fish has got to break the surface. And as soon as it does, this noctilia will home in on him. And what he has here are these humongous gaffs back here. His toes have been turned into huge gaffs. And what he's going to do now is he's going to scrape it or put it in the water as he flies along. And he's detected a fish, and now he's going to gaff the fish, and that's the way he earns his living. He's called the fishing bat. Very, very elegant, very interesting demonstration of an adaptation to exploit a source of food supply for which there's little competition. The other bats became gleaners. What they mean by gleaners, instead of hunting insects in the open sky, what these guys do is they fly on the ground, all right, close to the ground. And what's interesting about it is they're echolocating and they're listening at exactly the same time. They've got basically two auditory systems, or two networks, and two different channels in their brain, one for perceiving their echolocation signals with which they're orienting, and the other to listen for any insect that's rustling on the ground. They can literally hear the footsteps of this insect. And that's what they do. They pick off these terrestrial insects by sort of hovering like a helicopter and listening for them while echolocating at the same time. One of the more interesting animals, at least that I find, this is the frog-eating bat. This was a bat discovered by my colleague Mike Ryan here at the University of Texas and Merlin Tuttle, who is the director of the Bat Conservation International. What these bats do, I still find quite remarkable. They echolocate, but they do is they're found in the tropics, and they cruise around at night. And what they do is they listen to the frogs sitting in a little pond chorusing. What the frogs are doing, of course, is they're looking for a night of romance. They're calling their girlfriends. They're advertising themselves to attract females to mate. So what he does is he flies around and he listens for the advertisement calls of these frogs. But he's got a problem. And his problem is that there are lots of different kinds of frogs in the tropics, and a lot of these frogs are poisonous. And he doesn't want to eat a poisonous frog. So what he's got to do now is basically have two auditory systems. One that allows him to echolocate, and one that allows him to listen to the frequencies of the frog calls, which are just about the same frequencies as our speech frequencies, and be able to detect and discriminate poisonous frogs from those that are palatable. And the one he favors most is this little frog here. It's called a Tungara frog. And as you can see, he's about to pounce in on this Tungara frog, and the poor Tungara frog, well, yeah. And I'm going to show you a movie of this. It's really quite remarkable. Here he is. This is a Tungara frog, and you're going to see a little bat homing in on him. Little bat, a Trachops, frog-eating bat. Just grabs him out. There is a really interesting story about this. This is not just a little interesting demonstration. There is an incredibly interesting story about it that has profound implications for evolution and a thing called sexual selection. The problem is that this little Tungara frog is sitting there, and he's calling his mates. And there's a lot of other males calling mates, and he wants to make himself more attractive to his mates. And what he does in order to do that is he adds components onto his call. And every time he does that, not only does he make himself more attractive to the ladies, but at the same time, he makes himself far more conspicuous to the frog-eating bat. And there's this trade-off between your success in mating and attracting mates, and at the same time, getting eaten. And this is a major theme in evolutionary biology that has to do with sexual selection. Yes. A lot of these bats now evolved ways of tapping into a source of sugar and pollen, that is, from night flowering plants. And there's an entire ecosystem that evolved in order to do this, because the plants basically are sitting there and they're presenting themselves to the bats. The bats come, they pick up the nectar and the pollen. Of course, their job is to then to pollinate other plants, just like the birds and the bees, well, not the birds, but the bees do. Right? It's a source of pollination. And this is also quite a remarkable story, as I'll show you in another bat in just a moment. Some of the specializations these bats have evolved with their huge snouts and their huge tongues in order to get into the pollen and get into the nectar so they can get this sugar treat. Right? At the same time, plants, in turn, have evolved a number of ways in order to attract bats. It was just a marvelous article in Nature. This is one of the magazines in Science, in which one of my German colleagues has shown that some of these plants actually have formed structures on them that are such that they are almost resonators, but only of the particular calls made by the bats that normally visit them in order to pollinate them. Other flowers have adapted colors that allow the bats that come out during the evening sky or in the evening to see them, but to see them in an interesting way, and that is through ultraviolets. Bats can also see, some bats can also see ultraviolets, and the plants present themselves and decorate themselves in order to make themselves attractive to the bats in order to achieve pollination. Yeah, there's another one. Look at the tongue. Oh, boy, that's really some adaptation. Some eat fruit. And of course, everybody knows these guys. These are the vampire bats, all right? I love this picture. He looks so goofy, doesn't he? I mean, look at that expression. Look at the little teeth there. You see those teeth? They're razor sharp. And what he does, he doesn't do like Dracula. He doesn't come in, grab your. He doesn't do that. What he does instead is extremely interesting. These guys are like acrobats. They can hop in ways that it's almost unbelievable. So what they do is they feed on mammals. They'll come close to a mammal. They won't land on him when flight. They'll come close to them. They'll hop on him. And what they do with these teeth is they make a nick because they're like razor sharp. And the nick starts to bleed. And the saliva, in turn, has anticoagulants in it. They then extend their tongue into the bleeding cut that they just made, which is prevented from clotting by the anticoagulants in their saliva. They then have ripples in their tongue. What I mean by ripples is they have peristaltic action. That is, their tongue just sits there and it ripples the blood up into their, like this. Yeah, I know. On the other hand, if you think about it for a moment, all right, this is one of the most nutritious things one could ever hope to eat, right? All the nutrients are there. This is a very effective way to make a living, although this is not a very palatable animal, all right? So you see this enormous diversity that's occurred. I mean, these are really interesting animals. And they're interesting for a lot of other reasons that I just don't have time to touch upon. Right? They've exploited virtually every food source in the world. But I think they're interesting for another reason as well. And that is that they have a very, really sophisticated means of vocal communication. And the reason for that is going to become obvious in a moment. They live in humongous colonies. I mean, the bats in Austin, for example, and in the surrounding area, these Mexican free-tailed bats, just live in caves that number in the millions. Right. Those are bats. Right. They're coating the walls. It's absolutely amazing. Now, you have a colony of animals like this. Remember, these are mammals. These animals have to establish a certain social structure. The males have to have territories. They have to attract mates. Mothers, if you can imagine, have to know their babies. Babies have to know their mothers. It's pitch dark in there. How are you going to do this? You don't do it with visual displays. You do it with acoustic displays. You have to have vocal communication. And being an acoustic animal to begin with, it is absolutely a natural. Right? And that's what they do. They talk to each other, and they talk to each other with a very sophisticated way and a very sophisticated language. But I want to show you this movie first. This is from Bracken Cave. Right? This is what happens when they come out. Alan, you don't have to go down to the Congress Street Bridge. You just have to watch the movie here. All right? This goes on for an hour every night. I mean, it is absolutely amazing, the numbers of animals that are in there. That's the Congress Street Bridge. So, how do we notice? How do you go about studying something like this? How do you find out about it? I don't know. This is a real problem because you can't go into the caves. I mean, you got 20 million animals, right? The guano is that high. It's dangerous in there. There are so many nasty things in that guano, it's not funny. The ammonia levels will just poison you. This is a formidable problem. Well, we're very lucky. And the reason we're lucky is because of this lady here. This is Miss Barbara French. Barbara works for Bat Conservation International. And what happened I guess about 10 years ago, people used to bring to me, now they bring to Barbara, thank goodness, injured bats. There's so many bats around here, somebody is bound to get injured and be found by a person, and they want to then find out, how do I do? What do I do with this poor injured bat? So they call up now Bat Conservation International, they give them to Barbara. Barbara started to nurse them back to health, right? And Barbara fell in love with the little bats. She started to accumulate a whole colony. And it got so big, she had to build a barn in her backyard. She lives on outskirts of Austin. And she now has a colony of about 70 bats that she knows very well. She's had them for about 10 years. Barbara hangs with bats. She loves them. Right? But Barbara just isn't some woman who loves her bats. Barbara is an absolutely world-caliber biologist. She understands these animals, and she knows the literature, and she knows what to look for. And she has something that you can't teach and that you don't get at universities. She has a certain empatico. She knows them. She knows them like Jane Goodall knew her monkeys. This woman knows these bats better than anyone in the world, barring none. And I have brought experts like Don Griffin and others, world experts in animal communication, over to Barbara. They walk out, they are blown away by her scope of her knowledge, the depth of her knowledge, and the authority. And I thank goodness that she's here because she's told me a great deal. All right? And the way she does this is she keeps her little bats here, you know, in a cage, and she makes these little pouches. And Barbara makes these little pouches, and she knows who lives in the pouches. Newt lives in his pig, lives in his Benson. She names them all. She got 70. She feeds them every night. She knows them by name. She knows who their parents were. She knows who's upset, who's dominant, who's not dominant. She can tell you everything about them. All right? So one of the things she told me is that during the breeding season, what the males do is they take up a residence in each one of these pouches, and they claim it as their territory. And they do this to attract females for mating. Right? And one of the ways they attract females is very, very, very neat. I'm going to show it to you in a moment. What the bat does is as follows. This is Sid, okay, one of Barbara's bats. Sid's hanging from a pouch here, all right? It's mating season. So what does Sid do to attract the ladies? First of all, he douses himself in his variety of different chemical secretions that he has. They're called pheromones. They're attractive to females. And he hangs on a pouch there, and what he does, he wafts his pheromones with his wings into the females. It's sort of eau de cologne, if you will, his perfume. And at the same time, he's going to croon. He's going to sing to them. He's going to serenade them with his courtship song. And I want you to listen to his courtship song because it's remarkably complex. All right. It's composed of a variety of phrases. All right. You see each of these little blips here. These are recordings that we made with an ultrasonic microphone of his courtship call. And each one of these little blips here, see these things that are pointed to by the black arrows? They're syllables. They have an identity. They have a certain acoustic structure. And the thing here, the other one here, right here, whoop, whoop, right, this one, pointed by the red, this is a different syllable. Right? And this group forms a phrase. I'm going to let you listen to it in a moment. Right? There are rules to constructing this phrase. The phrase is always constructed in this way, with these syllables first, followed by one of these syllables. We call these A syllables and this B syllable. Doesn't take much imagination, but that's what we call them. So they're always constructed from several A syllables and terminated with a B syllable. Then what he does is he takes these syllables, these phrases, we call them chirps, these phrases right here, and he repeats them. And then at the end, he ends this with an enormous flourish. The flourish consists of a repetition of a different group of phrases. We call these trills. Right? And this is what two of these chirps sound like. Incidentally, the rule is courtship song always consists of a variable number of these chirps that are constructed in this way, and it's always terminated with a trill. This is what a chirp sounds like. Here are these several A syllables. This is a B syllable. And here are two of them. And this is the trill. This is the way he'll end his call. All right, so now, here he goes. Listen to Sid wooing the ladies. The ladies are in here. I don't know about you, but that's elaborate. I had no idea they did this. I thought they made little squawks at each other. Right? This is an enormously elaborate song that follows certain rules that's designed for a particular purpose to convey a particular kind of information. But that's not the only information they have to convey, because he's got his territory here and he attracts all these ladies into it, right? And what happens? Well, girls you know and guys you know, some other guy's going to try and horn out. He's going to try and steal his girls, right? He's got to protect his territory. So, what happens then? Oh, we're going to move on from here. What happens then is that this is Joshua, there's another bat. Joshua has got his territory, and this is his harem that he keeps in his pouch. This is one of the females in Joshua's harem, right? So now, what's going to happen is Joshua's got to defend his harem, or he's going to lose it. The way he defends it is if anyone even begins to come close to his territory, he sings his territorial song. And what he's saying to them is, keep away from my girls. And if they don't, a vicious fight ensues. And sometimes this fight is so violent, it results in the death of one of the individuals. So here is Joshua defending his territory against an intruder with his territorial song. Okay? Joshua the bat. So, what we have then is we have Barbara. Barbara has this colony. She knows these bats extremely well. We have the equipment, right? So what we're doing is we're working with Barbara, and we're trying to really come to an understanding, not only of recording these songs and cataloging them, but to understand what the language of these animals is and what the use, how they take various components of that language and recombine it, and what those recombinations mean and how it works. And I think this is going to be an extremely rich area of investigation, because then, of course, what we want to understand is how the brain processes those things. So what I really hope to leave you with are three messages here. The first is that echolocation is really quite a remarkable ability. That is the ability to basically substitute your sense of hearing for your sense of vision. And what I mean by that is actually to construct images, three-dimensional images, which you normally do through your sense of sight, with your sense of sound. Number two, that bats are sophisticated animals, that they live in a rather complicated social environment, where they have to establish various social kinds of rules. Males have to keep their territory. They have to attract females, mother infants, which we didn't show you, as well as a whole host of social interactions have to take place, which is all done through a means of vocal communication. And the repertoire of this vocal communication can be incredibly rich and quite sophisticated. And the third thing is that there's enormous adaptability in these animals. There's enormous diversity. They've been able to take basic features and just tweak them and change them a little bit in order to exploit a new food supply. Fishing bats, for example, with their gaffs. Nectar-eating bats with their extreme tongues. Vampire bats with their sharp teeth, their saliva, and their their tongues, and a whole host of other different ones which I haven't shown you. We could have spent all night looking at different kinds of bats. There are 1,000 different kinds. That's enough. All right. But I want to leave you with this because I have certain thoughts on this from a neurophysiologist's point of view. And that is, I look at this and I say to myself, what must this be like? I sat sometimes when I used to go down to Jamaica to catch these animals, I sat by the cave, I look out and it's pitch dark out there and there's nothing but a jungle out there. I mean, a really dense jungle. And in the evening, after the sun goes down, I look out there and it's pitch dark, you can hear these bats rocketing out of the cave just right past you. And I'm saying to myself, what do they see? What does this world appear to them in their brains? How does it look? Because I look out there and I see absolutely nothing. What does a little insect that comes into their space look like to them? How do they handle this? What goes on in their brains? And the next thing I ask myself, and I'm very much reminded of Spallanzani and Griffin in this regard, I have to ask myself all the time, well, how do they do it? How do they navigate with such speed and dexterity in this pitch dark and recognize objects and avoid everything and find their way out and go 50 miles away, know where they are, come back to the same cave, or even migrate 100 miles? The bat's here. Someone asked me tonight, Al Bard asked me tonight, bat's still here. Because what the bats in Austin do, of course, is they migrate to caves in Mexico. Well, they don't just go any old place. They go to the right cave. How do they do it? How do they know where to go? How do they navigate in the dark, in the pitch dark? These are all really intriguing questions about how the brain works. But I also have to wonder because, these are mammals. And nature takes certain things that it makes, and it doesn't radically change them every time a new species evolves. It preserves those things. And it did the same thing with the bats. And as far as I can tell, and I've been studying the nervous system of these animals for 30 years, they are prototypically mammalian. They have the same kind of connections, the same kind of nerve cells. The nerve cells have the same kind of neurochemistry. They look anatomically the same. They physiologically respond the same. They look to me as if it's a cat or a rat or a mouse or any of these other kind of animals that auditory physiologists look at to investigate the auditory system. Yet there must be something different. There's got to be. They're able to echolocate. Right? What that is has eluded me, and it's eluded me for a long time, and I have looked very hard for it. And what that tells me is that there must be something different in that brain. But whatever is different must be very subtle, and it did not involve a major restructuring and reorganization of the auditory system. It involved some kind of tweak and change. And that point applies to the entire, in fact, it applies to the entire animal kingdom. If you look at these bats, one has to wonder, what did nature do to tweak and change a little brain in order to allow a fishing bat to detect the fish, as opposed to the Mexican free-tailed bats to detect the insects out there, as opposed to a bat who goes for pollen? It wasn't major restructuring, it was just a little tweak and a little change. But it allowed that animal to change its behavior and its sensory abilities to an extent that it allowed it to exploit a new food supply that allowed it to be successful. So whatever lessons we learn from these things, how the brain evolved, how it changes even in minor ways to produce major changes in behavior, I think are lessons that not only will apply to bats, but will apply across the animal kingdom. And I think it will tell us a great deal about what is common that we share with our brains, with other animals, and what we don't share, what is unique to our own brains. And that, to me, is one of the reasons why I happen to study these animals. So I'd like to thank you and the outreach program for having me, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, George. Whoa.
Whoa.
I think it's on now.
Get blown away here.
George will be happy to answer a few questions. If you must leave, please be extremely quiet if you get up to go, because people want to ask questions and hear the answer. And before we have the first question, I want to acknowledge the people in the Center for Instructional Technology for doing the webcast, those technological wizards. Also want to acknowledge another school group that's here, Keeling Middle School. Are you paying attention, Keeling Middle School? Yes, you're here. Excellent. Who has a question for George?
That's a very good question. It really is. I mean, everybody asks the question. We'll turn to echolocation in a moment. I don't know. Certainly, there are certain things about the vocal communication that are not learned. For example, when bats give birth, it's quite extraordinary. They don't give birth head first, it's feet first. And the feet come out, and these babies are huge. They're almost a third of the size of the mother. Right? Well, they have to hang on that cave. They have to be prepared. They can't. They have to be quite precocious. Legs come out, grab onto mom. While even before that happens, mom is emitting what she calls directive calls. And as soon as baby comes out, and as baby is coming out, mom is continuing this stream of directive calls. But almost the moment the bat is born, it replies to mom with isolation calls. They bond. They get to know each other. This must be innate. I don't know how a baby can learn that quickly, and what it's going to learn from is unclear. All right? So there are certain things that are certainly innate. All right. There are certain things that are sexually dimorphic. The guys make the territorial and the courtship calls, not the girls. Presumably, this is hormonally regulated. Do they learn their territorial calls? And to what extent do they learn their territorial calls? And are there dialects that are different from one cave to the next to the next? I don't know. A lot of these things are incredibly intriguing, and we've thought about them, and we hope to address some of them. Right now, the first thing we want to address are the really basic issues, and then move on to the more complex issues. But it's a really good question, and I wish I had better answers for you, but I really don't know. With regard to echolocation, I don't know how to test that. That's the problem, because if you take the way one normally does experiments like this is you take the baby and you isolate it and you raise it in some fashion by feeding it and so forth. You can't do that with a bat. It'll die on you. So it's difficult to raise it in an environment in which you know it's only gotten one kind of acoustic signal and not the other. And these are serious problems. So my suspicion is that it's probably a little bit of both, but I don't know. I don't know. I'm just guessing. Okay. Yes?
How much variation is there in the courtship calls, and do they change over time, like until an individual male changes call?
Those are things we want to look at. Sure. Yeah, the question is how much variation is there in the emission of these courtship calls? So in the beginning of for example, in the breeding season, are the calls emitted with the same vigor and flourish as they are in the middle or the end of the season? That's one thing we want to look at next year. Do they change? And at the same time, to ask the question, do they change with hormonal levels? And if they do, can you then administer the hormones and change the call just by the administration? I mean, these are all things, this is brand new to stuff. But it's a good question, and it's something we certainly want to do. But I don't have an answer for you. Oh, we got a question over here. Sir.
Why do the bats live in such huge colonies?
Why? Yeah. It's a good question. The answers I can give to you, I think, are basically twofold. One is, and you know, again, there's no evidence for this. It's just a rationale that makes sense. One is, of course, you conserve energy. When you're together like that, you create heat. And to do this, that is to fly, is very expensive metabolically. It takes a lot of energy. That's why they have to eat so much. So if you live together and you group together, you tend to conserve body heat. I think the other reason probably is that you probably have to hunt together as well. So these, you know, these pictures and these bats that you see going out from the Congress Street Bridge, they're going up to hunting grounds, sometimes 10,000 feet in the air. They're looking for insects that are being carried by the currents up there, as well as hunting below. They'll hunt almost anywhere, but they hunt in massive groups. So I think these two things together have formed that. I might add also that not all bats form large colonies like this. Some bats are solitary, like the frog-eating bat. It's a solitary bat. They live 2 or 3 together, and that's it. They don't live in these huge kind of colonies. So it depends on what species, the variation, and so forth. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I have one more question. Has the use of insecticides affected Austin's bat colony because the bats eat insects?
Ooh, I would assume it did, but I don't know. I really don't know. I guess it's something I should know, but I don't know. Sir.
George, we have a Matthew here.
Oh, there you go.
Sorry. We have a question from the webcast. How keen is the sense of smell? Can they detect an individual among millions of smells?
Yes, it's very keen. They're smelly animals. You know, I don't know, you walk out here, you might not know what you're smelling, but I smell them in the street. And they have these huge Gular glands on them. I mean, these animals stink. They really do. And the way, you know, they don't think they stink. They obviously like it. But one of the things they do to attract females is they have pheromones in the Gular gland and in their urine. I mean, they'll just rub themselves all over the place and then, you know, pee in it, and they'll rub themselves in all of this, and the pheromones are then wafted to the ladies, and a good deal of this is done on the basis of olfaction. They have huge olfactory bulbs. I mean, they have a very, very well-developed sense of smell. Yeah. Sir?
Yeah, do they receive echolocation like dolphins through the skull, or is it the same? Is it a different?
Well, the dolphins. Yeah, well, the dolphins actually emit their signals through their skull. They have special structures up here for transmitting the signal. No, these are done laryngeally, through the mouth, or some of them do it through the nose. Dolphins will radiate it out through their head. And the hearing is, again, done by ears. Right? That's why they got these huge ears, all the better to hear you with. Okay. Sir?
My question is kind of related to that about the dolphins. Are there other animals that do echolocation, or is this something that's just involved in mammals?
No. It's evolved several times. There are birds that echolocate, oil birds and cave swiftlets. There is another group of bats called the Megachiroptera, which are almost a different suborder. They don't echolocate except for one group that does, but it's done in a very primitive sort of a way. So echolocation in mammals, at least, has evolved at least 2, perhaps 3 times separately and independently. One among the whales, one among the bats, right? And perhaps twice among the bats, depending upon how you want to break them up. It's not such a difficult thing to do. There's a room over here in the Macy's building called the Dallenbach Room. And what Dallenbach did many years ago when he was here is he showed that the blind can be taught to echolocate. That is, by tapping and listening to echoes, one can detect objects. I mean, they don't do it as well as bats, no question about it. But we have to handle echoes. I mean, I'm handling them right now. And this is just a very, very sophisticated form of doing that. Yes, sir.
Okay, well, since the bats live in such large colonies and they're all talking to each other, do they ever get confused, or does each bat have its own frequency?
I don't know if they get confused, but the trouble, They live in such huge colonies, right? Do they ever get confused in terms of what they're saying to each other?
Like, do they, like, when they're trying to talk to one person, do they hear someone else back?
Yes, I'm sure they do. I don't see how you can't, right? So the question then becomes, right, how does the auditory system sort all of this stuff out, right? Well, if I had the answer to that, I wish I did. I don't know how I don't know how you do that. Because all these things, I mean, it's really a profound question. It's really a great question because all the signals are coming back at the same time and they all have a similar acoustic structure, and you've got to pick one out from all the others. Good question.
You know anything about ancestors?
Well, they're thought to have evolved from insectivores, from tree shrews and hedgehogs, which are insectivores, not from tree shrews and hedgehogs per se, but from insectivores. That is the thinking. Right? And it happened a long time ago. These are very, very old animals. That is, the fossil record going back more than 60 million years found bats that virtually are modern, almost modern in form. So they evolved, they split off very, very early in mammalian evolution. Sir. Yes?
Okay. If one species of bat mates with another species of bat, would it make a new species?
No. No. Pardon me? If one species of bat mated with another species of bat, would you derive a new species? And the answer is no. Ma'am?
Is it true that certain insects give off fake echolocation calls back to bats to confuse them?
Yes. In other words, there's a whole story here. I didn't know whether to tell you that story or show you the communication signals. But it's really a fascinating story. And the story involves the problem of the insects literally getting ravaged. And they fought back. And they fought back in a number of ways. One of the ways they fought back was by evolving ears. And the evolution of an ear is not a difficult thing to do. It's just a matter of taking a hollow structure here, putting a little membrane on it, and attaching some nerve cells on it, such that when it moves a little bit, you stretch the nerve cells and they signal the brain. And there are moths, for example, noctuid moths, who have 2 neurons, one on each side, 4 neurons in the brain. 4 neurons, that's all. And it's only designed to detect bats. They can't tell what it is. They only can detect bats. And one of the nerve cells is very sensitive, and one of them is not sensitive. It takes a lot of sound to drive it. And it turns out with the way this works is that the moths are sitting there, right, and they hear a bat come. Okay? And they can tell the direction from which the bat comes by the loudness of the sound in one ear compared to the other ear. This is a standard way in which all animals determine the location of high frequency. So if it's louder in this ear than in this ear, they know it's coming from there. Right? Now, if it's louder in this ear than this ear, but still a bit faint, what happens is only the sensitive nerve fiber fires. And what that does, go into the brain, starts a circuit, and it causes that moth to take off directly away from the bat. And the advantage of that is that the bat's calls are really loud, and the moth can hear it when it's about 50 or 100 feet away, but the echolocation system is not a long-range system. It's a very short-range system. It only works for about 15, 20 feet ahead. The bat can only see about 15, 20 feet ahead of him with his echolocation. The moth can hear him farther away, so the moth has the advantage, and he takes off the bat and never even knew he was there. However, the bat's a lot faster than the moth, and if the bat happens to catch the moth and comes close by, it turns on not only the low frequency, or the sensitive nerve fiber, but the high sensitive nerve fiber. There's something else in the circuit in the moth's brain, and what it commits him to do is to dive immediately, right down. And what's interesting about it is that he does it differently every single time, so there's no way of predicting exactly where he's going to be, except he's going to go down. That you know, right? And that, the evasion there is he's so close, you can't get away from him, so you better get down and avoid him. And these are fairly successful strategies. The third strategy that they evolved was a strategy to, well, there are two really. One strategy is supposedly that they try and jam the bats. That is, when they hear the bat, they make a click, and they attempt to jam the bat's sonar. And there's a big controversy about whether this really works or not. I don't know, but that's the idea, all right? Alternatively, they can make sounds that tell the bat, basically, that I'm similar to another insect that makes sounds that doesn't taste very good. So keep away from me, all right? So there are all different ways and all different strategies that the insects have used to fight back against the moths, against the bats. But the bats still win most of the time. All right? Okay, take one from this side. Sure.
Is there evidence for collaborative hunting? And specifically, can one bat echolocate off of the vocalizations of another?
There's certainly evidence for collaborative hunting. I don't think so, but then again, it's a real problem. You know, you got all these guys hunting, and forget the hunting for a moment. Let's go in a cave. You know, how do you know? How do you know if you have a whole bunch of bats flying around, whose echo is whose? And I don't know exactly how they solve that problem. I think if you could seriously come up with a way of figuring that out, yeah, they'd be very interested. They would be very interested in that. Sure.
How do we know that you hear the footsteps of the beetle as opposed to just sensing that there's an anomaly on the ground with the echolocation?
By anomaly, you mean?
Something different on the ground and it's moving, so that it recognizes that that's a bug and not a little rock or something. How do we know that it hears the footsteps and recognizes that that's food?
All he has to do is hear something down there. All right, whether it's the footsteps or rustling leaves or anything, boom, he'll go to it. All right.
Okay, I guess my question is, how do we know that it uses a different kind of sound as opposed to just the echolocation, sensing that there's...
Oh, because you can have them perched, and you can just take a little insect and make just a little noise or put them down. And if there's stuff around, you can measure all this stuff with microphones and stuff like that. If there's sound and noise to be made, the bat will come and get the insect. If there's no noise, he won't get the insect. And yet he's not emitting echolocation sounds. Sure. Pardon me? Oh, that's a good question. Because little animals usually don't live very long. Like mice, you know, and rats. You got a 2-year-old mice, that's a very old mouse. That's really old. Right? That's ancient. A bat, although it's not, but in fact it's even smaller than a mouse, can live 20 to 30 years. Yeah, and one of the reasons that we think they can do that is because they go into the caves all day, and they go into a state called torpor. Temperature drops, their metabolism drops, and they just sort of hang there for a long time. And they don't have to expend much energy, whereas, mouse is running around all the time. But yeah, they live for remarkably long periods of time. That's one of the things that Dr. Griffin discovered. It was quite remarkable. Look, you got a question.
Why do female bats carry their babies underneath them?
Why do
female bats carry their babies underneath them?
First of all, I don't know where else they carry them. Where else? I don't know where else they would carry. Pardon me?
Like on their stomachs, their babies when they're...
Well, they're hanging on. The babies are hanging on, either underneath them or on their stomachs, and mommy's got to fly.
Why do they hang on to them?
I guess they want to take them... Well, some bats actually take their babies from one place to the other in a cave or even outside. These bats don't. They won't do that. They won't carry their babies. They have to go out and hunt by themselves. So they leave their babies behind. And what happens if you go into one of these caves in July, because they all give birth about the middle of June, you know. You see walls like this, they're pink. They're just baby bats. So mom's got to come back now. You can think about this too. This doesn't answer your question, but mom's got to come back, and she's got 1 million babies here, and she's got to know who is hers. She's got a problem.
Like, why do the females mate? Do they have to mate?
Well, let's put it this way. If you don't mate, it means that your species dies out and there won't be any more bats. I can give you a different answer than that if you want. And I'll tell you what the answer is, okay? There's something right up here that makes you want to mate. All right? It's all in here. It's part of your brain. Okay. Sir.
This is along the lines of his question. You mentioned that they have two different kinds of hearing. They can hear sounds as well as their own echolocation. How different is their hearing or their sensory in their ears to allow them to do that? Is it very different from ours, or is it very similar?
It's in these gleaning bats, these bats that are able to echolocate and listen to things rustling on the ground at the same time. They have really extraordinary nervous systems. I don't know much about their ear because their inner ear hasn't been studied, but their brains have, and their brains really have been changed markedly from other animals, much, much, much more so than any other bat I've ever seen, than any other animal I've ever seen. And they have two streams of information that are coming up. One from part of their inner ear that hears low frequencies and part that hears the high frequencies. And the whole arrangement of the neurons and the way the neurons respond to sound is so radically different in these two. It's really quite remarkable. So there has been, in these animals, I guess I misspoke a little bit, in these particular animals, there has been a real major restructuring, right, that enables them to do this. And it's quite a task.
Is the auditory area
huge?
Huge?
Oh, they're just huge. That's another reason for studying that. It's huge. Yeah.
So, George?
Yes.
Another question from the internet. This comes from Stephen. Vampire bats, these, quote, bats from hell. Do they attack humans? Can they kill a human? Are they accurately displayed in movies? Are they more dominant over other vegetarians than bats?
Well, yeah, they'll attack humans, but not the way they do in the movies. You know? They don't go for your jugular. Although I have a lot of fun with people when they come in the lab. I sometimes tell them, if you want to go into the room, you got to put them a garland of garlic, you know. And they don't know whether I'm serious or not. Now, they will. The way they work is if you're sitting there or sleeping, and there's a vampire bat around, he'll nick you. He'll jump on you. I mean, they're very ginger. They're very, very high-strung. But they'll hop on you and they'll nick you. Yeah, they'll take your blood. They're not prejudiced. They're equal opportunists. And can they be dangerous? Yes, they can convey very, very nasty diseases, including rabies and others through their saliva. So you don't want to mess with that. They won't drain you of blood. Well, maybe they will if there's enough of them, but that's usually not the case. The major problem is contracting a disease from being bitten. That you don't want to do. Yeah.
A couple more questions.
May I ask?
Sure.
You told us about how the bat interacts with its prey. Can you tell us how what happens otherwise when there's the bat is the prey?
The bat is the what?
Is the prey.
Oh.
How the system works when they are the prey?
Oh, it doesn't work.
Okay.
There are bats that are carnivorous bats that will eat other bats, but they usually do it in the caves. You know, there are not many other predators of bats, but there are some. For example, whenever you go to a cave, or even outside of the university if you're observant, because they're in all the rooms here, and the bats come out in the evening, there's always a hawk circling around. They're also in the caves, there's always a snake and one or two other animals hanging around. But you got 20 million, at least in Bracken Cave, 20 million bats coming out, so you lose half a dozen and a dozen. It's trivial. But I don't know, did that answer your question?
Mine?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Okay.
they're very efficient. They don't have predators.
Well,
They have few.
they're extremely successful. They don't have many predators. It's hard. You're flying out at 40 miles an hour at night. Who's going to? Not too many things are going to get you.
Thank you.
Sir.
Is there any evidence that the information that we're getting from Joshua and the bats that are living in that captured colony, that their behavior would be any different from the other bats? I'm thinking these guys are in sort of luxury condos compared to...
Absolutely. I have no idea. And that's something that will have to be looked at also. But first things first. And I mean, that's occurred to us. It's a very good question. And I don't have an answer for it, but something like that will have to be done. Absolutely. But it's really hard. How do you get that information? What do you do? How do you know who's saying what to what when you have so many animals that are so densely packed together? It's a very hard issue. Oh, another one. I think.
How long does it take for baby bats to come out of the stomach of a mom bat?
Minute or two. Great. Comes out pretty quick. They come out, they grab on, and they pull themselves out. It's really quite remarkable.
One last question for Dr.
Dr.
Can we talk about the Congress Bridge? How long had they been here? What do you know about them? The Congress Bridge. Why did they choose to live here instead of a cave?
Why did they choose to live in the Congress Avenue Bridge instead of a cave?
And what do we know about those bats?
All I know is if you have a crevice anywhere, they find it. I work in Patterson Labs, just across the street here, and at the very top on the roof, there is some kind of structure. There's a crevice. You go up there, there's a lot of bats in the crevice. Why did they choose this crevice? I don't know. They like tight, dark places where they can sort of hide, and they don't mind the heat. You get 120, 130, 140, they don't care. They just like these nice, and they all pack together like crazy. So why? I don't know. Pardon me?
The one at the top is safe from predators.
Oh, that's for sure. But why? I guess what she was asking, why the bridge and not a cave? I don't know.
Yeah, but what do you know about these bats? Is it good to have them here in Austin? Is anything bad about them here in Austin?
They're way up there, and they go out every night, and I come and watch. There's hard issues to get at when you have so many animals that are so inaccessible that are, it's difficult to do that. How do you do it? That's why Barbara French is so valuable. She's got 70 bats to live in her house. Yeah, okay, it's a great condo, but still, it's the only information we have. It's wonderful.
So the question is, are the Congress Avenue bats good for Austin? For tourism, yeah.
Well, sure. Yeah. They don't hurt us.
For bugs.
They were here before we were here. One more? Oh, sure.
I've always wondered is it just a simple adaptation that the bats have you said that guano and the level of gas levels would be toxic. I've always seen people who go into caves and study bats have to wear gas masks. Is it just a simple adaptation that they have that doesn't affect them?
It's got to affect them. First of all, a cave is a really nasty place. And even with these masks, if the filter becomes depleted, as sometimes happens, you can burn your lungs and get very serious damage. But this thing is just loaded, first of all, with guano and with urine. So there's ammonia coming up. I guess the ammonia rises at a certain point and doesn't get to the top, because if it did, I don't know how they could cope with that. I mean, bats or no bats, ammonia is going to burn your lungs. There's all kinds of other fungi down there. I mean, this is really dangerous stuff, this histoplasmosis. You can get incredibly sick by just fooling around in a cave. You really don't want to do that. There are so many insects that live down there that just earn their living by eating the worm. I mean, if something falls in that thing, they've had it. They're just going to be eaten. This is really a pretty nasty environment. How they cope with the ammonia, my only guess is where they are, there must be some kind of thermocline. It could not be that high up there. They just could not exist.
Seems like it's something quite easily testable, right? They can put the air sharply somehow.
I would imagine, but I've never done it. I don't know of anyone who has. You're right, it would be very easy to test, yeah.
Maybe you could do a thesis.
There you go.
Well, I'm sure George would be happy to answer questions if you.
Well, thank you for coming.
Yeah, let's thank you again.
Thank you.